Now, I'm going to tell you what happened to the Earl of Uxbridge. The Earl of Uxbridge, right at the end of the day, fell foul of a shell which exploded nearby and shattered his knee. By God, sir, I've lost my leg, he said to Wellington. And Wellington leaned over and said, by God, sir, so you have. There was a little coldness between them because Uxbridge had been cohabiting with Wellington's sister-in-law, and Wellington didn't like it. Presumably his sister-in-law liked it a lot, but he didn't. He went on to marry her, and old Uxbridge divorced his first wife and married eventually Wellington's sister-in-law. And over the two marriages, he produced 18 children, a significant number of them after he had his leg cut off. So having your leg cut off was obviously no barrier to procreation in those days. But here we are, somewhere here. This I am going to pass around on purpose. This is not just surgeon's kit, this is the surgeon's kit with which his leg was cut off. Now, most people don't get legs cutting off. They think you take a claw and saw it off. Well, you don't. You take a sharp knife and cut through the skin. Then you take a sharp knife again, and with a circular cut, you cut through the muscle. And when you get down to the bone, then you get a bone saw and saw the leg off. Because you can't saw. You try and saw the next pork joint you have. It doesn't work. It just doesn't. So that's how he got it off. But he was conscious. Those are his stirrups. They just made a collection of everything. No. No, they just had to gather up whatever they could. So he lost his leg and he was conscious throughout. Apparently his blood pressure didn't go up, and he noted at one point that he thought the saw might be a bit blunt. They dressed the wound and he hopped off the table. I know it's an awful pun, but that's what he did. He hopped off the table, thanked the surgeon, and hopped out through the door. Now that would be the end of the story, but it isn't, because this was done in the house hovel of a man, Hyacinth Paris family. His surname was Hyacinth Paris. I'm sure it sounds better in French, but I'm not going to try. And Hyacinth Paris, Mr. Hyacinth Paris, was a shrewd businessman and offered to buy the boot that the leg was in as well. And so, yeah, you can have the boot, you can have the leg. And he buried the leg in the garden. And then he put a sign up saying, here, in French, here lies the leg of the illustrious Earl of Uxbridge, who led the cavalry at the Battle of Waterloo. And then he charged people to come and see it. Shrewd man. The King of Prussia came to see it. It's not recorded whether he charged him or not, because do you remember adverts long ago, probably in the 60s, when somebody would advertise as seen on television, as if that somehow gave it credence? Yeah, absolute cobblers, just because it was on the telly. But anyway, you can imagine Hyacinth Paris written, as visited by the King of Prussia. And all was well. His wife eventually planted a willow over the grave, I suppose it is. And this willow, and everything was proceeding nicely until the 1880s, when in a storm, the tree blew down and the bones came up. Now, if the then Hyacinth Paris family had simply reburied the bones and planted a new tree, all would have been well. No, they got a glass case, but the bones in. These are the bones, not these are buried, these are the bones. Well, Uxbridge's successors visited and got absolutely furious that their ancestors' bones were on display, and it generated a diplomatic incident. You can't show our great uncle, or whatever he was, his bones like that. Yes, I can, they're mine, I bought them, in French. Anyway, the diplomats got involved and a compromise was come about. And nobody knows quite what the compromise was, but the bones disappeared. And they stayed disappeared until 1930, when the last male of the Hyacinth Paris line died. And his widow went through his belongings, and in his desk, what should she find but these blasted bones with a note saying what they were? And she knew the history. She knew not again. So she put them in the incinerator of the central heating, and that was the end of Uxbridge's bones. He went on to be offered. He accepted the Earl of Anglesey, became the Earl of Anglesey. He had a place built for him, Plasneworth. Yeah. National Trust now. There's a huge column in the garden with Uxbridge on the top of it, with both legs, by the way. He was the first person to have an articulated wooden leg. And the one on display is one of many. If you ask them how many wooden legs have you got in this place, they'll tell you that they've got quite a number, because everybody who made prostheses, wooden leg prostheses in those days, sent him one, because what they wanted to say was, as worn by. So I'm not sure which manufacturer actually made the wooden leg he plotted around it, but you can almost imagine them by being royal appointment to His Majesty's supplier of wooden legs. And that was the end of Uxbridge's leg. Marshal Ney, at the Battle of Waterloo, had survived miraculously, led every charge that he could possibly lead, and he was entirely unscathed. He had 5 horses killed under him, and still came out unscathed. Him and Wellington spent the whole day on the battlefield, not being shot at, because nobody was deliberately shot at, really. Shot toward by everybody who owned anything that could shoot. And when the English army advanced on Paris, Wellington very wisely left the Dutch and soon to be Belgians behind, because he was afraid of the depredations that they would cause. He advanced through France, and I love this story. At Cambrai, a sergeant's guard, a sergeant, a corporal, and 4 privates got solidly drunk. Like falling down, like only an Englishman can do, drunk. They're probably Irish, I expect. But anyway, drunk as newts. They could no longer open barrels anymore, and they found a barrel, and they thought the easiest way to open it would be to fire a musket ball into it, which indeed was the easiest way to open it. The tiny, tiny problem was it wasn't a wine barrel, it was a powder barrel. And all 6 of them went up in the air a considerable distance. And they survived the blast. I think 2 of them subsequently died, but they were all unfit for further service. You can imagine on the way up them sobering up no end, and by the time they bounced for the 3rd time, that was a mistake, wasn't it? That was almost the last time that British soldiers saw death and destruction in action. Wellington was determined to get to Paris first, because if Blücher got to Paris first, he was threatening to blow bits of it up. The Parisians have a bridge. We would pronounce it Gina, Jena, but the French write it Iena. But I'm going to do Gina because it's easier for me to say. There's a Pont Gina, and it is erected in remembrance of the huge victory of Jena Auerstedt of Napoleon over the Prussians, which allowed him to occupy Berlin. And the Prussians burned with indignation that this had happened. And Blücher wanted to blow up that bridge ever such a lot. He really wanted to. And Wellington didn't want him to with an equal passion. So Wellington placed a British guard on the bridge, just march them down the bridge, don't do anything else, knowing that Blücher wouldn't dare blow up English soldiers in pursuit of his vendetta. And indeed, he didn't. In fact, no bits of Paris got blown up, fortunately. Although I don't know, some of it's a right rag old Paris. There'd probably be bits were improved if they'd blown them up. Still would be. So that was the advance. Wellington then was made commander of Paris. He was put in charge of everything that was going on in Paris. Eventually, the Prussians and the Austrians arrived, and there were endless parades, and they all looked very good, except the British, who were not given new uniforms. They had to tack together as best they could what they'd got. So the Prussian Guard would march past in plumes and decorations, looking magnificent, and the Austrians would march back in plumes and decorations, and the British would shamble past in the clothes they fought in, looking anything but decorous, but highly victorious. And that went on for some time, something called the peace dividend, because by then we were starting to dismantle regiments because we didn't need them anymore. And Waterloo had percolated into the British psyche. Places all over the world were now called Waterloo. And strange to say, you will all have heard of this, but I'll tell you where it comes from. You've all heard of Watergate. Well, for a long time, every American scandal was the gate. Didn't matter what it was, you just put gate at the end of it. Well, the Brits put Lou at the end of it. So in 1819, when they read the Riot Act and suppressed a riot in St. Peter's Fields in Manchester, it became the Battle of Peterloo. But there's another one, not far from Wellington, Shropshire, by coincidence. There were steelworks, and the steelworkers got very uppity because they started cutting their wages because nobody needed the steel anymore. They didn't need steel to make guns and all the rest of it. And they went on strike and got very, very annoyed and occupied a spoil heap. And they anybody who came anywhere near them, they threw slag at them. Slag is very sharp, very, very painful. And it became known as the Battle of Cinderloo. And in fact, the yeomanry were called out. In somewhere in here, Lord knows where, deep mess. Here we are. Shropshire Yeomanry, 1815, the Battle of Cinderloo. Never heard of that battle, have you? No, most people haven't. Blucher. Blucher, at the time of the battle, was an old, drunk, semi-delirious some of the time. I love giving this talk to provost members because I say, well, probably in their 70s or 80s, and drunk and slightly doolally, and then I look quietly round at the audience. You know what I mean? And they all do. Anyway, he eventually lost it a bit and was convinced he'd been made pregnant by a French soldier and was carrying an elephant again, not the same elephant, a baby elephant. And he didn't live long. He died shortly after, a few years after the battle, but greatly admired. Here is his mausoleum. And he lay there peacefully until the Second World War, when the Russian advanced. The Russians sort of disinterred him and played football with his skull, which was a very sad end to a distinguished career. I said Wellington came over to foresee Paris, but he did come over eventually because the government wanted a memorial to the battle. But they didn't want to spend any money. There's nothing new under the sun. So, well, what can we do? We could build an arch, like the Arc de Triomphe. Oh no, that's probably not a very good idea and very expensive. We've seen how big it is. It's huge. No, it cost a fortune. And eventually somebody, probably some lowly clerk in some official office, the penny dropped. Sir, the Strand Bridge Company are building a bridge across the Thames. When it's finished, it will be called the Strand Bridge. Yes. But if we change the name of the company to the Waterloo Bridge Company, or when it's finished, it'll be called Waterloo Bridge. Why the hell, that's a good idea. Not only is it enormous, useful, it's been built by a company. So as far as the government is concerned, it's free because it's sold by subscription. So they got to it. By a stroke of a pen, the Strand Bridge Company became the Waterloo Bridge Company. And when it was finally built, it became the Waterloo Bridge. And on the 18th of June, 1819, 1 year exactly after the battle, they opened it. The Prince Regent opened it with his brother, the Duke of Cumberland. Wellington came over from Paris. There was a band. There was a 60-gun salute. There was a fair. There was an enormous amount of bunting. There was food. There was drink. There was a right hoo-ha. And they opened the Waterloo Bridge. It then settled into calm middle age. In the middle of the 1800s, it became the favourite place for people to commit suicide by throwing themselves into the river. It's not clear to me whether they paid the toll and then went across the bridge and committed suicide, or whether they got across the river on another bridge, which was free, and then walked to the middle and then threw themselves in. But I suppose it's a moot point, really, if you're going to throw yourself in the river. Anyway, it just sat there. It sat there being a bridge and doing what bridges do, carrying traffic. And it did that right until the early 1900s. And at some point, the old London Bridge, with which most people have seen pictures, with all the shops on, all the buildings on, many, many piers, very narrow, and lots of buildings built on it, got knocked down. And when that happened, the whole flow of the Thames altered. It flew faster for a start. There have been no ice fairs in London since they knocked the London Bridge down, because the London Bridge slowed the water down enough for the ice to freeze, to form. And during the early part of the 20th century, the piers of the bridge and the abutments of the bridge started to erode. And eventually, you could not deny that if something wasn't done, the bridge would eventually fall into the river. What are we going to do? Well, there's one, and you know the name, Herbert Morrison. He was the leader of the London County Council. There isn't one anymore, but he was the leader of the London County Council. So what they did in the first instance to lower the traffic was to build a steel bridge, that's them knocking it down, next to the stone bridge, so they halved the traffic. So one side went one way and the other side went on a steel bridge. That was only a temporary measure, and everybody agreed that we got to knock the bridge down and build another one. So they started in about the 1920s, knocking it down and taking it away, and built a new Waterloo Bridge, the one we've got today. And they built it, and they built it, and they built it, and they finished it. Of all the years to finish a new bridge in 1942, when the Germans were paying a particular interest in what was going on in London, and they couldn't open the bridge with any sort of fanfare because it would attract attention. And the last thing they wanted to do was attract attention to it. So they had to, it was used, but it wasn't officially open. It wasn't officially open until 1945, when Herbert Morrison, now deputy leader of the Labour government at the time, cut the ribbon. There was no band. There was nobody really. The Tory opposition objected to the spending of £168 on bunting. Now, I tell you could buy a lot of bunting in those days for £168. So there wasn't any bunting. The damn bridge had been in use for several years. So Herbert Morrison cut the tape, walked across the bridge and declared it open. And everything went back to normal. For the 200th anniversary, they went to great lengths to mention it by polishing the plaque. Now, speaking of Wellington coming over, Wellington was in Paris and overseeing the arrangements for the taking over of Paris, but he came over for the Waterloo dinner in 1821. And thereafter, on the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, there was a Waterloo dinner. Now, in the first instance, all the generals were invited. The King came along, Lord Bathurst came along, and so on and so forth. And they had dinner, and everybody toasted everybody else and probably got slightly tipsy. And come 1836, now 1836, we've got William IV on the throne. Pliny has died. He got to be George IV for a bit. But he died, and now we've got William IV on the throne. So here's a picture, a painting, brace yourself, and this is the Waterloo dinner of 1836. And there's a lot of people on there who are well known to us. There's Lord Bathurst, there's the King. Wellington is toasting the King there, yes, he is. I've got a plan of who everybody is if you want to read it, but it'll take you the rest of the evening. It's a real good old boozer. Down the middle, they've got 100-weight silver table piece given them by Portugal, made from captured French silver. Lord Bathurst looking particularly well. This is the 1836 dinner. He died in 1834, so I don't know what he had to eat. It couldn't have been much. So you think this Russian taking people in and out of photographs is a new thing? No, only we painted them in and out of ours. Lord Bathurst is there, and he died at least 18 months previous. Anyway, they had a lovely dinner, and the following year, the King was on his deathbed. So he instructed his doctors that he was going to live beyond the 18th of June, because he knew that if he died before the 18th of June, they could hardly hold a great big sumptuous dinner with a king lying freshly dead on his catafalque. So he survived. He died, I think, on the 20th or the 21st of June. But that was the end of an era, because, of course, women couldn't go. Mere women couldn't go to the Waterloo dinner. It was a man-only thing. Sorry, you can't go. Doesn't matter what you say. Even if you were there with a bayonet yourself, you couldn't have gone. And Victoria couldn't go. And the first year, Albert declined the invitation because he didn't know any better, really. And somebody must have said something in his ear like, listen, you have to go to this. So he went every year after that until he died. And that was the Waterloo dinner. It still goes on. Now, you remember this chap? I need a volunteer. Come and hold this up in the air for me, please. Show it to the assembled throng. This chap is Sergeant Charles Ewart of the Royal North British Dragoons. I've brought that on previous time, but this is a different story now. He captured a French eagle during the charge of the Royal North British Dragoons. I'm going to give you this in advance. Don't tell anybody what it says. Okay? Good. He survived the battle because he was allowed to carry the eagle to the rear and didn't rush back. Very sensible man, Charles Ewart. Eventually rocked up in Manchester in the cotton trade, the weaving trade, and died there and was buried in Bethel Street Cemetery. As with all our heroes, his grave was covered over and slabbed over and he was forgotten. And that continued until 1933. Oh, in the meantime, sorry, I beg your pardon, he was promoted to ensign, which is the lowest officer rank. So he became a private who became an officer, ensign. And that gave him a pension of 100 a year, which was quite significant. And he died, and they dug him up, his fellow members of the Royal. And there's a little sign going around there, which is written over his grave. But notwithstanding all the things that happened to him, he had the highest honour that any Scotsman can pay to another Scotsman. He had a pub named after him. The Ensign Ewart, and apparently the beer's quite good there. My daughter went, she said the food was crap, the beer was quite good. But Prinny also wanted to give the soldiers who'd taken part a tangible sign of their bravery and action. So they developed something called the Waterloo Medal. This is not a real one. If it were a real one, it wouldn't be here. If it were hundreds and hundreds of pounds. This is a facsimile. Brace yourself, coming your way. The Waterloo Medal, about 65,000 were minted, and they were presented to everybody who had taken part in the campaign, not necessarily at the battle, which meant that a significant number of British soldiers got a medal without ever seeing a Frenchman or firing a shot in anger. They got a medal, but they hadn't done anything. So the existing army, the older army, Wellington's old Peninsular Army, were furious. They got absolutely nothing for their efforts, because with that medal went the right to be called a Waterloo man and 2 years pension rights added on. So if you served 26 years, you got 28 years pension. And that was significant for all of them. So the Waterloo Medal was a double-edged sword. And in fact, the General Service Medal wasn't actually given out until years later, the 1830s. And the last surviving member of the charge of the Scots Greys is this fella here, John Dixon, Sergeant Major. And he's wearing his Waterloo Medal and his military service, General Service Medal as well, with a clasp. And that's for fighting in the Peninsular War. Because I assume some of you may have been in the military, but when you get a medal for a campaign, but if you fought in separate battles, you get a clasp for each battle. So some of these medals will have half a dozen clasps on them, showing which battles they took part in. And he was the last surviving member of the Royal North British Dragoons, the Scots Greys, who charged at Waterloo. Now, there's a lot have been written and pictured about Waterloo, and one of the people who tried to make a lot of money out of it, I'm afraid you're on again. Quite. So here we are. We've got that one. We'll start with that one. That one, please. And then I'll hold this one up because it's smaller and lighter. Both of these were painted by a lady called Elizabeth Thompson. She is far better known by a married name, because she married a general of cavalry called Butler. So she is Lady Butler. Now, this is a portrayal. That is a square of British infantry at the Battle of Quatre Bras, which was 2 days before the Battle of Waterloo. And it purports to show the 28th Regiment of Foot. Now, it's a brilliant painting. It's wonderful. It's accurate. The faces are brilliant. The uniforms are brilliant. And it's entirely wrong, because they've all got the wrong hat on. Now, I know it doesn't matter to you, but it matters to me. The 28th Regiment of Foot, the Gloucesters, is a light infantry regiment. Heavy infantry, they're called shakos, by the way, the headgear. That is the shako of a line infantryman. I'll send you around in a minute. And the bell-top shako of a light infantryman is like that. Those men are wearing that, and they should be wearing that. So either they are not the 28th Regiment of Foot, or she's painted them wrongly. You are. Send the hat around, please. Now this one, this is Scotland Forever. This is the charge of the Scots Greys. And at first glance, it looks wonderful. The only problem with it is that if you extrapolate the track of the first 5 horses, they all meet where that man in yellow is sitting. And if 5 horses meet at a point, the mess they make is enormous. She's got a perspective alter cock. They charge in lines, not in angles. Can you see? If you look closely, the penny drops that those horses are going towards each other. And about 2 or 3 feet in front of this picture, they will arrive together and embarrassment will result. So Lady Butler wasn't that bright after all. Thank you.